Unfortunately, the only way that we're going to break out of this echo chamber, this sort of self-imposed bubble, if you will, is if we have to go over to where that action is happening. And unfortunately, where the action is happening is essentially, it's a sewer, but we're going to have to get our hands dirty.
You're listening to the TRIBECAST on tribejournal.org.
Okay. We're here with Simon Plosker, Editorial Director of Honest Reporting. Thanks for making the time, Simon.
It's my pleasure.
What's your history with Honest Reporting? It's been a couple decades almost now.
I joined Honest Reporting back in November 2005, and I was there for another 14 and a half years. I left for a little bit. I joined United Nations Watch, another fantastic organization, and I've returned back home just in the last 4 months.
Amazing. Well, good to have you back home. Today I'd like to talk about the evolution of the digital warfare. It used to be like blast out the New York Times terrible article headlines and whatnot, and tell me about that process of when it dawned on you guys that you're actually pushing traffic to the New York Times, and that approach had to switch.
We've changed over the years because, gone are the days where you'd have one article a day that would come out of somewhere like the New York Times, and then you'd be able to spend literally a day or even 2 days sort of taking it apart and then putting something out there online and out to your mailing list. Today, of course, it's bang, bang, bang. We're on a 24/7, or I'm going to say a 24/6 news cycle, where we have to put stuff out as and when it's happening. And of course, it's no longer one article a day, 2 articles. We're looking in loads more places. The media itself has changed dramatically over the years. Whereas perhaps we'd be looking at sort of mainstream media outlets. Now, obviously, we mentioned the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, BBC, all the usual ones that we all know and not particularly love. But now we've got a whole load of other, if we can call them boutique media sites. I mean, today everyone considers themselves to be a journalist. Anyone with a cell phone is a journalist.
You're referring to like YouTubers and everyone.
Right.
Anyone and everyone.
Yeah, and they'll send these things to places like Vox, Vice News, just stuff going out on Twitter, Instagram. Only recently we've opened a TikTok account, and you said I've been doing this for quite a while. These are things that my kids are using, but we've had to we had to keep up with the times. We have to adapt to where the battle is.
Sure, we're fighting anti-Semitism. We're fighting media bias against Israel, but maybe there are times where we actually put more gasoline in the fire by sharing those particular articles and adding more viewers to see such bigotry and falsehoods.
I think it's a valid point. I definitely get it. And there's certain things which maybe if they're that horrific, we'll take perhaps a screenshot and put it on our own post rather than giving a link to someone to go and have a look and driving traffic there. But unfortunately, I think we have to recognize that these things, they're out there. And in the overall scheme of things, we're small. I just saw a study in the last couple of days which pretty much showed statistically that all of the pro-Israel advocates on places like Twitter and Instagram, we're almost operating in an echo chamber. We are almost divorced from where the main action is. If the main action is happening over here, we're kind of somewhere over here in a very, very small space. And unfortunately, the only way that we're going to break out of this echo chamber, this sort of self-imposed bubble, if you will, is if we have to go over to where that action is happening. And unfortunately, where the action is happening is essentially, it's a sewer. But we're going to have to get our hands dirty. We're going to have to go in there and start responding directly to all these horrendous charges and libels and the anti-Semitism that's out there, because we can talk amongst ourselves and say how awful it is, but if we're not there actually getting our message out to the uninformed people who are being poisoned by this sort of stuff, then we're wasting our time. And there's no way I'm planning on wasting my time or my organization's time. We've got to be there. We've got to be there responding directly.
It's interesting how the algorithms have actually almost created the polarization that societies are seeing, whether it be left or right, whether it be pro this or anti that. The algorithms are certainly contributing greatly. And not just that, but adversaries, nation and non-nation states. At TribeJournal, we did a documentary on this, on how Twitter is weaponized in order to create and foster more. It's like dumping gasoline on that polarization, creating more of a bonfire. And then until like with the specific intention of getting countries to destroy themselves from within. So what you're saying is very interesting to me, because you're saying that process where you have almost you've created your own little echo chamber that not only could people you're not reaching the people that need it most, right? In activism, you have 40%, 40%, and it's the 20% in the middle, right? You're not going to convince the other 40%, but the 20% in the middle is the target, so to speak. And if that's the case, you're saying you're really boxed in a certain way because of the algorithmic calculations that they actually foster you to be in your own echo chamber, and you want to break out of that. Now tell us, how do you intend to do that? Like, you don't have to give us the whole roadmap here. Obviously, you're in the middle of World War III online, but like, what are some ways that this can be accomplished?
Right. I would actually say that the sort of the centre ground, the people who can be convinced either way, is larger than 20%, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, places like Twitter rely, and the algorithms rely on getting people angry, getting people enraged, and the stuff that's being put out there against Israel, against the Jewish people, it's enraging to us, and of course it's sort of clickbaity to people who don't know any better. One thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to descend to that level, and perhaps one hand is tied behind my back, because I'm not going to go to the sort of lengths that the opposition are going to. The same way that we're going to be demonized by them, I'm not prepared to start demonizing innocent people, for example. There are people out there who will say terrible things about the Palestinians, for example. But we're not going to stoop to that sort of level. But what we will do is give out information and videos and content that will appeal to a wider range of people. So we're not just talking to ourselves. We're not just preaching to the choir, if you will. It's got to be stuff. Unfortunately, I said I've been doing this a long time now, and it hurts me that the average attention span of the viewer these days is kind of a little bit more than a goldfish. So we have to adapt. We have to get those talking points, the messages have to be broken down into something that's going to be in the space of a minute and a half tops. I personally, I'm old school. I'd prefer to read a whole, a Megillah. Maybe not a Megillah, but something with a little bit more meat on it. But these days, the kids, the stuff they're looking at. My son, he's 15 at the moment, so he's kind of he thinks he's an expert on TikTok and Instagram and all these things. Dad, you need to catch me in the first 3 seconds. That's like, seriously? 3 seconds? You haven't got the patience to sit and wait longer than 3 seconds to find out if this video is interesting to you? No, he hasn't, and that's what we're working with now. So it is what it is. But we've got to appeal to these people.
It's very interesting that you're saying that. I mean, I think statistically they found that 3 seconds and 10 seconds were major benchmarks in terms of that's the algorithms actually, not just your son, but the algorithms actually tune into the 3 second mark. If a person clicks off in 3 seconds, then that's not going to get to the top of it's not going to rise to the top of the trending or whatever measurements that they use to measure these things. But what you're saying is a totally different ballgame now. It's really, if you're putting out that short 1 minute or whatever it is, 30-second clip, I think it's very interesting the way you put it, that people share what they're enraged about. And according to Professor Jonah Berger over at the Wharton School, emotion is a big driver of virality online and offline, actually. So how many people are that passionate about truth that they would click on it? Because again, you have to somehow reach more than the people who would be angry about a biased headline.
The beauty of the algorithm is, if the people out there spreading the hate are the ones sort of getting people enraged, maybe getting people upset about Israel, about what those Jews are doing, we can use that to our advantage, because if we're putting our stuff in those particular conversations, then other people are going to be looking at this and they'll be also getting enraged. Perhaps they'll be getting enraged at the response that we're giving as well. And of course, it then reaches a wider audience. And at least,
but will they? I mean, think about it. Let's try to bring this down a little. Article, two people were murdered in cold blood, and then there was a riot. And a lot of headlines trending right now don't mention anything about the murder at this point.
so I think we have to distinguish between audiences here. So there's a big difference between the sort of audience that's looking at the headlines of places like these titans we were talking about, the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, etc., etc., and the sort of people that are into the blood libels and the horrendous anti-Semitism that's being spread out there. And some of it, of course, is coming from influencers. And of course, we've had the whole thing with Kanye West or Ye or whatever he wants to call himself these days. I can think of a lot of things I'd like to call him, none of which I can say on camera. But there's a big difference there. So there's two ways of dealing with this. We're going to be in there in the conversation with those, where the anti-Semitism is and the anti-Israel, the anti-Zionism. And we're also going to be taking apart things like the headlines and putting out actual facts and content and what you may want to call the truth of what's actually going on here, because that's also important.
Calling them out when they say falsehood, how does that impact their bottom line per se? Or is it just to chip away at their believability and public trust?
I think it's a mixture of all of these. Ultimately, we are definitely out there as being truth tellers, if you will. It's important that we see ourselves as educators as well. It's not just about getting the record straight with a media outlet. We've got to educate not only the wider public, but also our own people as well. There are lots and lots of people who are sympathetic towards Israel who are out there right now, desperately looking for answers. They're picking up their copy of the local paper and they're seeing these terrible headlines and the awful stories, and they're wondering, what's going on. And on campus, for example, the students are facing terribly tough times, and they want to withdraw. They may be pro-Israel, but it's not worth their while because they do not want to stick their head above the parapet, and we have to arm them with facts that they can use.
So that sounds more like Hasbara and not fighting the false headlines. How are you arming them by just giving them the ammunition to say, well, that article was misleading? How is it, or are you saying that's the springboard for the true story?
No, it is the springboard for the true story. And in terms of the content we produce, I mean, there's a variety of things we can use here. We mentioned the short videos for people with short attention spans, but we've also, our bread and butter, if you will, is the more detailed takedowns of particular articles where we'll pick them apart. We'll give out the facts, the stuff that was missing, the context that should have been in there, tearing apart factual errors as well, getting the corrections. But we also do, larger pieces as well, where we'll discuss, for example, one of my editors suggested just today that we need to put out something that explains we'll go back to the Oslo Accords. What is the difference between areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria? And why is it that everyone is saying Israel is in breach of this particular thing, that particular thing? Well, the Palestinians themselves also signed on to agreements which they haven't kept as well, and it's worth pointing these things out. We want to give our people enough background information that they'll feel confident in themselves that they're getting good information that they can use, and more importantly, that they understand what is going on here, because this is a very, very complex situation we're dealing with. And unfortunately, the other side has broken it down into, it's become very binary, black and white, and it's zero sum. And unfortunately, we are fighting almost a zero sum game right now. And well, that's one thing I will never forgive our enemies for doing, because we're Jews. We like to argue amongst ourselves. Two Jews, three opinions. And if we were to sit down and have a civil conversation with someone who was genuinely interested, they may not be pro-Israel. They may be anti-Israel. They may have certain concerns about what's going on here. But if we could sit down and have an actual civilized conversation, I think our story is very, very compelling. And you'd probably be able to convince them. But we've now reached a point where it's a shouting match, and clearly we're not going to convince the people who are doing the shouting on one side, but unfortunately, between all the shouting, what you thought of as the 20%, I think is perhaps higher than that. These people all they're hearing is a lot of background noise, a lot of screaming, shouting, and they're not getting the information, and it's a real shame.
Well, I would say that, like in America, for example, the political scene is like 40% are Democrat, 40% are Republican, and it's the 20% in between, ballpark figures, but 20% in between that swing the elections, right? And let's take that concept and bring it over to Israel advocacy, or really, you guys aren't Israel advocates, you're more headline advocates, truth advocates. But in that light, I mean, there seems to be a whole lot more anti-Semites out there than not. In other words, the number is not 40, 40, and 20. The number is probably closer to 90 and 10. That 90% of the world's population, which is consuming, or even the English-speaking world's population that are consuming content about Israel, are probably 90% anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm not going to
go there. I don't think,
but it's certainly not 40% that are not anti-Semites, right?
I don't think that that the majority of people are anti-Semites. I think that a lot of people are very, very ignorant of the facts. Of course, there are anti-Semites out there, and I think it's one of the saddest things about my job that over the years I've seen the actual bona fide anti-Semitism increase. One thing I will say is that to pan the entire media as anti-Semitic is very unsophisticated.
Has it increased, or has it always been there and now it's just surfacing? And I think that's, when I say 90% or 80%, whatever it is, that is the aspect. I grew up in a city that was, mixed Jews, Gentiles, and I found some of my closest friends that would slip up and say an anti-Semitic statement. It sounds hard to believe. People I was literally in diapers with. And they would say, so there's very deep rooted anti-Semitism that's really buried not just beneath the surface publicly, but also within people. And there's stereotypes that are not being addressed by the media, not being addressed by the Jewish media even. Stereotypes that need to be potentially addressed and at least acknowledged. The number of people and Jewish people in Hollywood, the number of Jewish people in banking. I'm not making generalizations that they run the world or anything like that, but there seems to be, like Dave Chappelle makes a joke on Saturday Night Live, like, whatever you do, don't say the Jew word, and so in some regards, does that alienate? Joe Rogan recently said something that went viral. Are we alienating people who were allies or are allies to Jews and to Israel, and then suddenly we alienate them because they slipped up, like my good friends that I was in diapers with? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think we have to distinguish with intent. There are some particularly nasty people out there on the far left and the far right. I mean, it's easy when you're dealing with the far right. You can see, these are the Nazi jackboot type people. It's kind of obvious. On the left wing, again, they hide it a bit better, or maybe they don't hide it, but to the average person, they don't seem to be, the average person who thinks that an anti-Semite is only sort of, your everyday Nazi. This isn't the case anymore. I'm a great subscriber to the horseshoe theory, where far left and far right sort of meet in the middle, and they both have the same issues with Jews. But we have to distinguish about intent, because there are people who genuinely hate Jews out there. I've seen them, we see them online. You can see some of the disgusting stuff that's being put out on Twitter, some of the responses we get to our content as well. If I put out a tweet, you'll get a whole load of people commenting underneath. And someone like, for example, you mentioned Joe Rogan. Do I think that Joe Rogan is an anti-Semite? No, I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I think he's ignorant. I think he is basically a victim of a wider culture that has absorbed anti-Semitic tropes. And unfortunately, we're now in a process of trying to reverse this sort of thing, or at least educate people as to why this is seen as an anti-Semitic trope. Because a lot of these people would be quite horrified if they actually thought that they were being anti-Semitic. There's some people who wear it on their sleeve, but
as a people, I think it's safe to say we have PTSD.
Oh,
It was a
absolutely.
tough 20th century, right? And you know, sometimes when I see the headlines, I wonder, are we being hypersensitive? Like, can we be a little like when Dave Chappelle? I hate to say this, I'll say it publicly. I laughed at a lot of his jokes. It was pretty funny, and I thought it was very tactful. He's a very interesting way that he delivers things. Very bright. The way he delivers very difficult messages, and but you know, he got beat up by the mob, by the Jewish mob online, and so it's an interesting topic. Also, maybe we can go there if you're comfortable talking about this. You know, how far is too far, and do we have to choose our battles, especially given the fact that the Titans are so, you know, they're obviously not so careful with false headlines, but there's so many other smaller YouTubers that are much greater than the Titans that we're referring to: CNN, NBC, ABC, Fox News.
Look, we're dealing with all of them, but I think the bottom line in all this is you only have to look at the situation right now in terms of the anti-Semitism statistics on the street. Jews are being beaten up in places like Brooklyn, in New York, Los Angeles. We've got you know, anti-Semitic incidents happening in London, Paris, you name it.
Reported anti-Semitic incidents.
Right, and
because when I was growing up, we just took it to the parking lot. We never called the FBI. We never called the police. If there was anti-Semitism at school, someone was giving us a hard time, it went outside.
right, fair enough.
Things
But
solved themselves.
I think
Problems solved themselves.
we've probably moved on since then. I would hope.
Well,
and quite frankly, I think as Jews we should expect a level of protection. And the fact is that anti-Semitism is clearly on the rise.
Is it on the rise, or is it the reporting of it is much easier?
Well, both.
And
I think it's both.
And then it gets into the question of bias in terms of organizations that they, like the ADL, for example. The more I'm saying systemically, the way their revenue process works, it's actually, they make more money when there's more anti-Semitism because that pulls the strings in fear of the populace. So they're almost encouraged to, you know, show the uptick in anti-Semitism, which means it's in their best interest to make sure everything gets reported, which means we can't look at today's statistic and compare it to, say, the year 2000 or the year 1980. Because back then, like back in 1960, for example, people were literally beat up and the cops looked the other way. There's no real data to compare the trends, or is there?
Look, I think there is certainly data. I mean, if we're talking sort of going back to you know, the beginning of the 2000s, there's definitely data there. And I'm not going to comment on what other organisations are doing. I think, for example, the ADL is doing a great job, you know, reporting on the anti-Semitism. But ultimately, you know, I can also say the same thing about media bias. You know, if all of a sudden peace broke out tomorrow, then I'd be out of a job. But you know what? I'd be happy I'd be happy to be out of a job if you know, if it was that good. But I don't think I'm going to be. You know, my parnassus is not going to disappear just like that, sadly. It's a difficult situation. I don't think that we should ignore what's going on. There's clearly something is going on. We're seeing it. And of course, statistically as well, and if we're talking about stats, every time you know, Israel sneezes, diaspora Jews get a cold because you know, we've seen spikes in anti-Semitism happen when there's a particular conflict, an IDF military operation, for example, and all of a sudden it's not Israelis who are being attacked.
Interesting.
It's Jews.
Yeah, you're tying. Okay, so good. That's clear data. That's not a question of comparing it to 10 years ago or 20 years ago. That's showing that there is a spike in reports today based on what's happening in Israel and the false reporting, or even the true reporting that happens in Israel. Like we saw in May 2021 when we saw the Gaza, thousands and thousands of rockets coming out of Gaza at civilians in Israel. Very interesting point. Thank you for making that point. Let me ask you another question. Let's shift gears a little closer to home. I hate this to go to a controversial topic, but for example, Sheikh Jarrah, there were local newspapers that could have written the headline for TRT. Local newspapers that reported about Itamar Ben Gvir setting up his shop, his office in Sheikh Jarrah, making no mention in the headline or anything about the fact that there was an attempted murder 48 hours before to a Jewish family living in Sheikh Jarrah, making no mention, you know, about the 7 fire bombings against that person's car in the previous 6 months. Does honest reporting need to start looking inward and not just outward at all of the nations of the world, so to speak, media companies out there, but also looking inward at what Israel media companies are reporting and if they're being honest?
Okay, we don't, as a rule, generally cover the Israeli media. Certainly the Hebrew media. Israel's got a very, very robust democracy, freedom of speech, expression, and I would like to hope that Israelis here are sophisticated enough to actually critique their own media, which of course they are. There's also the Israeli English language media as well. You've got, J-Post, Times of Israel, Haaretz, etc., etc. Again, as a rule, we don't tend to critique them. What we might do is there could be a situation where, for example, and there has been in the past, Haaretz one time put out a piece by Gideon Levy, who I'm sure many of our viewers here are aware of, a very, very radical commentator in that newspaper. And he made the claim that a new poll, this was quite a few years ago now, a new poll of Israelis said that most of them actually supported apartheid. And of course, this is like jaw-dropping. And what was worse was it got picked up by international press. So I could have spent plenty of time going after the international press for this, but I had to go to the source. Haaretz was the source. I took one look at the poll and could see that Gideon Levy had twisted the entire thing. It was lies, essentially, and therefore forced Haaretz to correct. And once Haaretz was corrected, then of course you have the ammunition to be able to get all these international media outlets to correct as well. But generally,
that's not a fair fight, right? I mean, it's basically internal Israeli media sets up a lie, and then everyone picks up the story, and then honest reporting comes in and starts.
Look, it doesn't. To be fair, it doesn't happen.
Of course, the damage is done.
Often,
the damage is done once it's out of the gate, right?
Right, for sure. But luckily, it doesn't happen that often. I mean, granted, the journalists here, a lot of them get their information from very critical places like Haaretz, for example, and there are other far more radical news outlets now which are not mainstream but have clearly influenced some of these journalists. And we do try and keep an eye on them. But of course, ultimately, if someone goes and starts, watching Russia Today or Iranian press TV, clearly, you know what you're getting. It's kind of obvious. And the people who watch that precisely because I think they want to get that sort of coverage. On the other hand, we have Al Jazeera in English, which is relied upon, sadly, by a number of mainstream media outlets who fail to mention that what they're quoting from Al Jazeera is coming directly from a media outlet that is sponsored by the Qatari royal family. And the Qataris, remember, are sponsoring various terrorist organizations around the Middle East, including, of course, here in Israel. And that needs to be pointed out, that this is not a neutral, unbiased source. This is a station that clearly does not have Israel's best interests at heart. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Is it an issue of not putting enough content to provide those journalists in Washington or New York or or London or wherever enough of a balanced picture to write their story in a balanced way? In other words, is it right now, for example, in Gaza, there are reporters that they obviously have to toe the line, if they want the story. We saw Vice News was in Iran. They got a really exclusive story in Iran and Iraq, but they openly admitted that they had to toe the line. They had to play the game with the Iranian regime. And so, do we need to do a better job putting out more balanced reporting for those journalists who aren't setting foot there, that they're only going by with what they're seeing online, what they're seeing on these marketplaces for cell phone footage, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'm gonna kind of flip this a little bit. I'm going to get back to exactly what you said about sort of helping the journalists. I just want to point out, though, as well, that you made the case about journalists, in Gaza, for example. They're using a lot of Palestinian stringers, people who are supposedly helping these foreign journalists, or they're reporting from the scene themselves. And one thing we did over the last several months, we found that a lot of these Palestinian reporters, they are giving information to the journalists. So I'm being hassled by an anti-Semitic moth here. They're giving stories to major media outlets who are publishing them, and there's a clear bias there. And we took a look at some of their social media feeds, some of their tweets going back a number of years, and it was incredible what we found. We found people that were actually praising Adolf Hitler. It is absolutely mind-boggling. We're not talking about people saying
feeds of the reporters reporting from Gaza.
The Palestinian reporters themselves were saying that we support Adolf Hitler. If only if he'd only finished the job, and very, very similar things. And this was quite shocking.
This was a few months ago. You guys exposed that, right?
Yeah, we've exposed several reporters over the last.
That's part of the behind the scenes that aren't headline.
Right, so we expose these things, but as soon as we confronted these media outlets who'd been using them, and we call, this is a clear red line that has been crossed. Now, these people are. I'm not going to sort of change their very, very screwed up minds. However, someone with those sort of views should not be anywhere near being allowed to report on Israel, the Middle East conflict, or Jews, because clearly you're not going to get anything close to objective. We're not close to objective. We're getting something that's clearly skewed in a very, very hateful way. We're holding these journalists accountable. Now, as it happens, places like CNN, BBC, New York Times actually fired some of these people. Now, we're not going out there looking to get people fired, but there's some of these things, lines have been crossed, and ultimately it's up to the media outlet themselves to take the appropriate action. And we think in these particular cases, appropriate action has been taken. What was more, I think, disturbing as well was following this, there was an open letter from by 300 Palestinian journalists complaining that we had initiated a smear campaign against them. Hello, a smear campaign? We didn't need to do a smear campaign. These particular journalists publicly promoted anti-Semitic content. And we're not talking, I don't like Israel. It was, I support the genocide of Jews. It kind of speaks for itself. And it's actually quite remarkable that these people think that there's any excuse, any justification for this whatsoever. But I do want to return to your point about helping the journalists. And there is an organisation. It's a project of Honest Reporting, Media Central. It works with the journalists. It's separate from Honest Reporting in the sense that I don't have anything to do with what goes on a day-to-day basis there. But they will actually organise field tours for the journalists, speakers from reputable places, bring in politicians. We can talk about, people from both sides, and that includes as well taking them to meet Palestinians as well, because ultimately, we have I said earlier, we have a very compelling story to tell, and what we're looking for is we're not looking for people to love us. We're looking for people to report accurately and fairly about us, and therefore give them both sides of the story, including ours.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant because the economics of media have changed online, and now you have, with all the banner ads, Google really took a chunk out of everybody's revenues.
Right.
And as a result of that, the salary that these journalists get is very difficult to really get out there and report a deep story, to get the truth. It takes a lot of time, and because of the economics of journalism today, it's very difficult for them to do that. So that's brilliant that you're actually making it easier.
But it's not even that. You're talking about the economics of journalism these days. Over the years, we've seen lots of media outlets that had dedicated reporters on the ground here have lost them. Now that's partially.
What do you mean lost them?
well, they no longer have anyone here. They don't have the money for it. And also the conflict itself is no longer center stage, if you will, in the world's attention. Obviously today we have a much bigger situation going on in Ukraine. And we've seen plenty of times where journalists here have actually sort of left en masse and gone off to Ukraine to report, and then there's no one here, or you know, certain media outlets will send reporters here temporarily, which brings its own challenges, because during times of crisis we have what are called parachute journalists who don't have a background here, not people who are sent to spend 4 years and and hopefully you would think would get a greater knowledge of what's going on. But they come in for 2 weeks and they literally report on what they're seeing, and they don't know the context properly, they don't know the history, they don't know the language, and they're at the mercy of the Palestinian stringers who are doing their utmost to help them get the story from their perspective. So today we have a situation where the journalists who are on the ground, they don't have the resources that they used to. Now, clearly there are bureaus here that, like the BBC, for example, yes, they are well resourced. CNN, obviously the New York Times has people out here, but there are large amounts of media outlets that are literally, one person out here who's, looking for stories, and if we don't help them, then they're going to go looking to the other side to find those stories, and they're going to go looking for conflict stories. And this country is far more than just about conflict. We have the incredible high tech going on here. We have, the beautiful beaches. We have, the water technology that we're exporting to the African continent. All these incredible things. You walk into an Israeli hospital, you see the medical advances, but not only that, you see Jewish doctors and Arab doctors working together, treating Jewish patients and Arab patients. And what is more powerful than these sort of things, to get rid of this disgusting and utterly false apartheid analogy that's doing the rounds these days?
What's the name of this organization, this new development at Honest Reporting? What is the...
Right, this is not a new development. Media Central has been around for quite a few years now.
It's like a team of like 4 or 5 people? Or?
Yeah, we have it's a team that works with the journalists.
I think that's amazing.
Helps them to get the story.
Access to stories and other sides of the story. So it's almost preemptive. We don't want to have to correct anyone. So therefore, we're going to help them get the story right the first time.
Right. So ultimately, as an organisation as a whole, holistically, we're the organisation that's working before, during, and after the story. It's. Of course, it brings its own challenges as well. But one thing's for sure: this country is never short of a good story. So we're never going to run out of those.
Simon,
for better or for worse.
I really appreciate you making the time, sharing your insights, and all the incredible work that you guys do. And the honest discussion is really important to us and our audience. We appreciate you making the time today and joining us here at the Tribe Journal and the TRIBECAST. We look forward to maybe getting together another time in the near future.
Definitely, I look forward to it. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the TRIBECAST on tribejournal.org. Thanks for being with us.